My name is Maya Reed. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that being grateful meant staying quiet. That's what I was taught. That's what I practiced. Even when my hands were shaking, and my jaw was tight, and every bone in my body was begging me to say something back. I thought silence was the price you paid when someone else owned the roof over your head. I was wrong. And it took my grandmother humiliating me in front of 200 people at my cousin's wedding for me to finally understand just how wrong I had been. The day started the way most days in that family started, with a list of things I needed to do and a very short window to do them. My grandmother had called me at 6:30 that morning, which was not unusual. She called early on purpose because she knew I'd answer. I'd always answered. 22 years of answering taught me it was easier than the consequences. She needed the centerpieces repositioned. She needed someone to confirm the catering count. She needed the card table near the entrance handled before the florist arrived. My cousin, whose wedding it was getting her hair done at a salon downtown. My grandmother wasn't asking her to do any of this. She never did. I drove to the venue in the dress I'd bought myself 3 weeks before. The one nice thing I'd purchased all year. A simple, deep green that I thought looked quiet and pretty without trying too hard. I spent 4 hours before the ceremony, making sure every detail was exactly where my grandmother wanted it. I moved chairs. I retaped table skirts. I smiled at the coordinator and apologized for things that weren't my fault. By the time guests started arriving, I was tired in the kind of way that lives behind your eyes. The ceremony was beautiful. My cousin cried at the altar, which made half the room cry, and I sat in the third row and watched, and felt a soft, uncomplicated happiness for her. Whatever complicated history existed between us and within that family, she looked genuinely joyful up there, and I let myself feel that without pulling it apart. For about 45 minutes, everything was just fine. The reception was where it unraveled. My grandmother gave a toast. That in itself was not a surprise. She gave a toast at everything: graduations, birthday dinners, the time my cousin got a promotion at her marketing firm. My grandmother believed that any occasion worth celebrating was an occasion that required her voice at the center of it. She stood up with her champagne glass and started warmly, talking about family, about legacy, about what it meant to carry a name with intention. People smiled and nodded. Forks clinked softly against plates. And then she turned and looked directly at me. "Some of us," she said, her voice still carrying that polished warmth, "were given every opportunity in this family out of pure generosity." She tilted her glass slightly in my direction, and 200 pairs of eyes followed the gesture. Maya was brought into this house when she had nothing and no one. And we gave her everything we had. The table nearest to me went quiet first. Then the quiet spread. She smiled like she was paying me a compliment. We just always hoped she'd find a way to truly belong here. Some things take longer than others. Someone at the bar laughed, one quick burst of sound, and then caught themselves. I felt my face go hot all the way to my ears. The bride's new mother-in-law was staring at her napkin. A woman across the room, someone I didn't recognize, frowned and looked away. My cousin at the head table made brief eye contact with me, and I watched her decide not to do anything about it. My grandmother raised her glass. "To family," she said. "The one you're born into, and the one you choose." Everyone drank. I was holding my glass and I set it down on the table without drinking because my hand would have shaken and I didn't want anyone to see that. I kept my expression still. I'd had years of practice keeping my expression still. What I couldn't control was the way my chest tightened, the way those words settled into me like something cold and permanent, brought in when she had nothing, given everything. Some things take longer than others. I had heard versions of those sentences my entire life, but never in front of 200 people, never with champagne glasses raised, like the humiliation was a celebration. I excused myself from the table about 15 minutes later and walked out through the side doors of the venue onto a terrace that looked over a small garden. The Atlanta evening air was thick and warm. I stood at the railing and breathed slowly and tried to decide what I was going to do. Not just about the toast. About all of it. About the 22 years of being the one who moved the chairs and retaped the tablecloths and answered at 6:30 in the morning and sat in the third row and stayed quiet. I pulled out my phone, mostly just to have something to look at that wasn't inside that building. I scrolled without really seeing anything until I noticed the venue's Instagram account had tagged me in a photo from earlier, a wide shot of the decorated reception hall that I had arranged. A detail shot, with the centerpieces I had repositioned at 6:30 that morning, tagged with my username. I didn't think anything of it at the time. About 10 minutes later, a woman came through the same side door I had used. I assumed she was a guest looking for quiet, and I shifted slightly to give her space at the railing. She didn't go to the railing. She stopped a few feet from me and said my name. My first name and my middle name. No one called me by my middle name. No one even knew it. I turned and looked at her properly for the first time. She was in her early 50s, maybe, with dark curly hair that was going silver at the temples. She was wearing a simple gray dress, not festive enough for a wedding guest. More like someone who had dressed carefully, but not for a party. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who is holding themselves together through an enormous amount of effort. "I'm sorry to approach you like this," she said. "I know how this looks. I saw the venue tag on Instagram about an hour ago, and I drove here because I couldn't think of another way." She exhaled. "My name is Diane, and I think you're my daughter." My entire nervous system went quiet in the way it does right before it goes very loud. I took one step back without meaning to. My shoulder hit the railing. "I know," she said quickly. "I know. Please don't leave. I have something I need to show you first, and if you look at it and you want me to go, I will go. I will leave right now, and I will never contact you again." She reached into the small bag she was carrying and pulled out an envelope. Not a clean white envelope. An old one, cream-colored and soft at the corners from being handled too many times. "I didn't take it. Not yet. I was told you died," I said. My voice came out flat, like I was reporting the weather. "When I was 3 years old, that's what I was told." Diane nodded slowly. "I know what you were told." She extended the envelope a little further. "Please." Curiosity has always been stronger than fear in me. That's probably the truest thing about me. I took the envelope. Inside was a photograph, old enough that the edges had gone slightly yellow. A young woman in a hospital bed, dark curly hair spread against a pillow, tired-looking but smiling a real smile. In her arms was a baby, newborn small, wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. The woman in the bed looked young, 20-something young, and something about the angle of her jaw, the particular way her brow arched even in exhaustion, made the back of my skull go strange and electric. I lowered the photo and looked at Diane's face. She was older now, but the jaw was the same. The brow was the same. My mouth went completely dry. "Before you find out what she told me next, if this story is hitting something you recognize, hit like and subscribe. Drop in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to know I'm not the only one who's ever stood at a railing at somebody else's party trying to hold themselves together. I'll tell you everything. Just stay with me." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the reception behind the glass doors seemed very far away, like it was happening in a different country. "I was 24, Diane said quietly. "You were 3 years old. There was a car accident. I was in Grady Memorial for 11 days. She paused. "During that time, your grandmother brought paperwork to the hospital. She told me it was a temporary guardianship arrangement, just while I recovered. She said I needed to sign it so the state wouldn't place you in emergency foster care while I was unable to care for you." Her voice stayed level, but I could see the cost of keeping it that way. I signed. I was on pain medication. I didn't have a lawyer. I trusted her because she was family. I stared at the photograph in my hands. "She told me you died." "I know. Diane said it the way you say something you've known for a long time and never gotten used to. By the time I was discharged and tried to get you back, she had filed for permanent legal guardianship. The documents I signed had been amended. The terms I agreed to were not the terms on file." She took a slow breath. "It took me 3 years to find an attorney willing to take the case, and 2 more years of hearings before I was told the paperwork was legitimate and there was nothing I could do." "How long have you been trying to find me?" I asked. "Since you were 6 years old," she said. The number landed somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and specific. I had been in that house since I was 3. I had grown up believing the woman who raised me was the only family I had. I had moved the chairs and answered the 6:30 calls and sat in the 3rd row and said nothing during the toast. And somewhere across this city, this woman had been spending 22 years trying to get back to me. Diane reached into her bag again, and this time, she produced a thin folder. "I've been working with an attorney for the past 18 months, she said. "When I tell you what we've found, I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to believe me on faith. I'm asking you to look at the documentation." I took the folder. My hands were surprisingly steady. Inside were photocopies, some official, some handwritten, and a short cover letter from a firm in Decatur I'd never heard of. "Your grandmother has received state support payments related to your care since you were 3 years old," Diane said. "Foster care subsidy, dependent tax credits, a housing assistance supplement. According to these records, she has collected benefits designating you as a dependent child in need of care since the year of my accident." She paused. "You are 28 years old. The payments only stopped 4 years ago when you aged fully out of the system." I read the numbers on the page in front of me and felt something loosen in my stomach, like a knot pulled from the wrong end. "She called me a charity case," I said. Not to Diane, really. Just out loud, into the evening air. In front of 200 people, 30 minutes ago. She called me a charity case. I looked up, and she's been getting paid for me the whole time. Diane's expression didn't change because she'd already been sitting with this information for 18 months, and she had already done whatever grief and fury looked like for her. She just nodded once. "There's something else," she said. "On the second page. The guardianship transfer document, the one she filed after my accident. There's a signature line at the bottom, a witness signature. It belongs to a notary." She pointed to a name I didn't recognize. That notary lost their certification 3 years before that document was filed, which means they couldn't have legally witnessed anything on that date. I looked at the dates. I looked at the name. I looked at the gap between them. "The whole thing," I said slowly, "was fraudulent." "That's what we believe," Diane said. "And we have enough documentation to file." I stood at that terrace railing for a long time. Behind me, through the glass, I could hear the DJ shifting into something louder, and the reception carrying on without me. I thought about every time I had been told I should be grateful, every birthday where I got a card and my cousin got a laptop, every time I asked for something small and was reminded of everything I'd supposedly been given, every version of the story where I was the charity case and my grandmother was the saint. I thought about the photograph in my hand, the young woman in the hospital bed who looked like my jaw in a mirror. I looked at Diane and said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "I want a DNA test." She nodded immediately. "It's already scheduled. Tomorrow morning if you're willing. A LabCorp site on Peachtree. Certified chain of custody. Legally admissible results." She paused. "I scheduled it 3 weeks ago when I found the venue tag. I hoped you'd say yes." That night I didn't go back to my grandmother's house. I didn't go back inside the reception either. I called a rideshare from the Terrace and sat in the back seat watching Atlanta pass outside the window and tried to locate something stable inside my own chest to hold on to. Diane had given me the number of her attorney, a woman named Carol who had left a voicemail that was measured and professional, and somehow still the most reassuring thing I'd heard in months. I listened to it twice. Carol said they weren't rushing anything. She said documentation was already in order. She said the most important thing right now was my safety and my willingness to move forward on my own terms. On my own terms. I had to say the phrase out loud to make sure I understood it correctly. My grandmother texted at 10:45 that night. "Where are you?" Not a question. A command dressed as a question, the way she always wrote things. I read it and set my phone face down on the nightstand of the hotel room I'd booked, using money I'd saved from 2 years of freelance design work I'd never told her about. Money I kept in an account she didn't know existed. I'd been doing that quietly for 8 months, not because I had a plan, but because something in me had known, in the vague, wordless way you sometimes know things, that I needed an exit I controlled. I didn't sleep well. But I didn't sleep badly, either. Mostly I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about a woman in a hospital bed who signed a paper she thought was temporary, and a little girl who grew up being told that woman was gone. The LabCorp office was clean and bright and smelled like hand sanitizer. Carol met us there, a woman in her 50s with short natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had a leather portfolio, and the specific kind of calm that comes from having done something methodical for a very long time. She handled the check-in when the technician asked for my ID, presenting alternative verification documents with a quiet efficiency that closed the issue before it became one. The test itself took 40 seconds. A swab, a sealed kit, a chain of custody forms signed and witnessed. Diane did hers in the next chair, hands steady, eyes forward. Expedited results, Carol told me as we walked out. 24 to 48 hours. Certified and court-ready. Waiting was its own specific kind of hard. I sat in Carol's conference room that afternoon and looked at more documents than I'd ever seen assembled in one place. The financial records going back to my childhood. The notary discrepancy highlighted in yellow. A signed statement from a former caseworker at a regional family services office who had agreed to provide testimony about how certain guardianship transfers were processed and occasionally facilitated during that period. At one point, Carol set down a printed page and looked at me across the table. "Your grandmother's attorneys are going to argue this was a family acting in a child's best interest," she said. "They will call it informal. They will call it love." She folded her hands. "What we have is paper. Paper doesn't call things love. Paper calls things what they are." My grandmother called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The message was about 20 seconds long and it started warm and ended cold, which was exactly her pattern. She said she'd noticed I didn't come back to the reception. She said she hoped I wasn't being sensitive about the toast. She said she had always done what was best for me, and she expected a call back before bed. The next message came from my cousin. It was softer. She said she thought grandmother's toast was a little much and she was sorry if it hurt me. She asked me to please not make this into a bigger thing than it was. I didn't respond to either of them. The DNA results came back the following afternoon. Carol handed me the printout without softening it. I read the bottom line twice. Probability of maternity, 99.997%. The page was steady in my hands and everything else was not. I looked across the table at Diane, who was watching me with an expression I had no previous reference point for. It was not triumph, and it was not relief, exactly. It was something older and more complicated. The look of a person who has been waiting for a long time for a truth that was always true. I said, "It's you." She said, "It's me." And then, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I let someone who wasn't me decide how close to get. Diane reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I didn't move away, and neither did she. And Carol very quietly turned to look at something on her laptop until we were ready to continue. Ready came about 3 minutes later. Carol moved fast after that. Not reckless fast, precise fast, the way someone moves when they've been preparing for a long time and the moment has finally arrived. She formally preserved the voicemails from my grandmother as documentation of communication patterns. She photographed the still visible stress marks at my jaw from 22 years of keeping my expressions still on command. She had me write out a full timeline, every financial restriction I could remember, every request denied, every time I'd been reminded of what I owed. I wrote for 2 hours. The list was longer than I expected. Carol reviewed the TikTok posts from the wedding reception. Several guests had recorded the toast and posted them. The timestamp was clean and the audio was clear. My grandmother's exact words, in her exact voice, in front of 200 witnesses with functioning phones. "She made it easy," Carol said, not unkindly. My grandmother's texts escalated over the following days. They moved from patient to impatient to something that started sounding more like warnings. She texted that she had documents proving she had given me everything. She texted that people in the family were worried about me. She texted, on day 4, that if I was speaking to anyone about private family matters, she would have to protect herself. That last one, Carol screenshotted immediately. "Control and motive," she said. "Right on schedule." A letter arrived on day 6, handwritten, which my grandmother reserved for things she wanted to feel formal. She said she loved me. She said she had sacrificed for me. She said she feared I was being misled by someone with bad intentions who was using my emotions against me. She said she hoped I would come home and talk to her like an adult before things became complicated. Carol put it in a plastic sleeve. 2 days before the hearing, my cousin called me for the second time. This time she was quieter. She said she'd found some old paperwork in the attic while looking for her own birth certificate. She said she didn't know what it meant, but it didn't look right and she didn't feel comfortable pretending she hadn't seen it. She texted me a photo of the document 20 minutes after we hung up. It was a subsidy certification renewal form from when I was 14. My grandmother's signature was at the bottom, dated and notarized, certifying that I was still a dependent minor in her care, requiring state financial support. The notary seal at the bottom was from the same office that had certified the original guardianship transfer, the same office that had been closed for 6 years by that date. Carol looked at the photo for a long moment and said, very quietly, she kept doing it. The morning of the hearing felt like standing on pavement after a long drive, that specific, unsteady solidity of being somewhere real after being in motion for too long. Carol met me outside the courthouse in downtown Atlanta with her leather portfolio and her reading glasses, and the same measured calm as always. Diane stood on my other side and did not try to hold my hand or say something meaningful. She just walked with me through the front doors. My grandmother was already inside, seated next to her attorney, a man in an expensive-looking suit who had the particular posture of someone accustomed to making problems smaller. She was dressed in her church clothes, the good navy blazer she wore when she needed people to see her as serious and respectable. When she saw me, she offered a small, pained smile, the one that said, "You are breaking my heart, and I need everyone in this room to witness it." I looked at Carol instead. Carol had told me to look at her. Today was not about performance. It was about facts. The judge was a woman in her late 50s who asked questions like she was reading a receipt. Clean, direct, no wasted language. Carol began with the DNA result. Probability of maternity, 99.997%. My grandmother's attorney objected on procedural grounds, and Carol presented the lab certification, the chain of custody documentation, and the 2 attending signatures, without raising her voice. The objection was overruled. Next came the guardianship document. Carol placed the original on one side and the forensic analysis on the other. She walked the judge through the notary discrepancy in plain language. Certification lapsed. Date of document. Gap between them. She did not say the word fraud. She let the dates say it. My grandmother's attorney tried to argue administrative error. The judge asked him to clarify what administrative error looked like across multiple documents spanning 22 years, and he did not have a clean answer. When it was my grandmother's turn, she stood the way she always stood, chin level, shoulders back, every inch the matriarch who had given and given and given. She called me her daughter. She said she had raised me when no one else would. She said the family had opened their home to a child in crisis, and that she was being punished for her compassion. Her voice broke slightly on the word compassion, and it was a practiced break, the kind I had watched her deploy at PTA meetings and church fundraisers and dinner tables for 2 decades. Carol played the toast. Not the full recording, just the 30 seconds. My grandmother's voice, clean and amplified and unmistakable, in front of 200 witnesses, explaining to the room that I had been brought in when I had nothing and had struggled to truly belong. The slight sound of that one person's laugh, quickly suppressed. My grandmother's attorney started to speak. The judge held up a hand. Carol followed with the financial records, subsidy payments, tax credit claims, renewal certifications, a column of numbers across 22 years that added up to something that made the judge's expression change in a very specific way. Then Carol turned to me. It was my turn. I stood up, and I put my hands flat on the rail in front of me, the way Carol had told me to, and I looked at the judge, and not at my grandmother, and I spoke. I talked about the attic bedroom with the window that didn't open all the way. I talked about being 12 years old and asking for money for a school field trip and being handed a permission slip but not the fee and being told to figure it out. I talked about the work, the constant ambient work, the tasks that appeared on my list and never on my cousin's. I talked about the word charity, the way it had followed me my whole life inside that house like a smell you can't locate. I talked about the toast, not as an isolated incident, but as a pattern with a public capstone. 22 years of being reminded I owed a debt I couldn't quantify for a gift I hadn't asked for. And then I said the sentence that had been living in my chest since the terrace at the wedding. My name is Maya Diane Reed. And I am done being defined by what someone else decided to do with my story. The room held very still. My grandmother started to speak. The judge asked her to wait. And in that pause, sitting in that Atlanta courtroom, with the morning light coming through high windows, I felt something shift in the space behind my sternum. Not loud, not dramatic, Just a door closing, gently, from the inside. The weeks after the hearing moved the way significant things move, not in a straight line, but in pieces that kept revealing more pieces. The fraudulent guardianship documents were referred for criminal review. The financial restitution claim moved forward with documentation Carol had been preparing for the better part of a year. My grandmother's attorney sent 2 letters that Carol described as posturing and filed appropriately. The subsidy and tax fraud referral triggered an audit. My grandmother's finances, which she had always kept private with the specific privacy of someone who needs privacy, became subject to review. The real estate she co-owned with a business partner came under scrutiny. The business partner, wanting no part of it, separated from the arrangement quickly and publicly, which my grandmother had not anticipated. The church she had attended for 30 years, where she had been a deacon's wife and a committee chair and a fixture in the lobby after every service, asked her quietly to step back from her volunteer roles while the review was ongoing. She stepped back. She did not make a graceful statement about it. The people who had known her for decades found themselves in the uncomfortable position of recalculating someone they thought they understood. My cousin called once more about 3 weeks after the hearing. She didn't apologize, exactly, but she said she'd had time to think, and there were things about our childhood she'd noticed and chosen not to examine, and she thought that had been a choice and not an accident. It was the most honest she had ever been with me. I thanked her and told her I needed time, and I meant it as neither a dismissal nor an invitation, just the truth of where I was. I moved into my own apartment in East Atlanta. 2 rooms, a window that I could open all the way, a small balcony where I put a single chair and a plant I was still learning how to keep alive. The first morning I woke up there, I lay still for several minutes, just listening to the absence of anything I owed anyone. Diane and I took things slowly, which was her suggestion, and also mine. We met for coffee twice before we had dinner. We talked about ordinary things, her job as a medical records administrator, my freelance design clients, a documentary we had both independently watched, and both independently found irritating for the same reasons. We were figuring out what the shape of this was. What family looks like when it starts at the beginning instead of inheriting whatever the previous generation built. She had a photograph of my mother, her older sister, who had died when I was very young, and who I looked more like than I had realized until Diane showed me a picture. I didn't cry, but I sat with it for a long time. Grief is strange when it arrives 25 years late. It's not sharp so much as deep, like finding a room in a house you thought you knew. On a Sunday morning in September, Diane and I drove out to Stone Mountain and sat on a bench at the base of the trail and drank coffee from a thermos and watched people go past with dogs and strollers and weekend ease. She told me about the years she'd spent trying to find me, the attorneys who took her money and delivered nothing, the dead ends in school enrollment records, the years she spent learning to live with an absence that never stopped hurting. I told her about the subsidy form, how I had found it in a filing cabinet 3 years ago while looking for a utility bill, and how I had looked at it and not understood what I was seeing and filed it in the back of my mind as something that felt wrong, the way you file things that are too large to process in the moment. She looked at me and said, "You always knew something wasn't right." I thought about that for a while. "I think I knew," I said finally. "I just didn't have permission to know it." She nodded like she understood exactly what that sentence meant, because she did. The settlement came through in October. I won't give the exact number because it belongs to me, and I've earned the right to keep some things private. What I will say is that for the first time in my adult life, I could look at my bank account and see something that felt like a beginning rather than a calculation of what I could just barely manage. I enrolled in a professional development course for independent designers, and I found a therapist in Little 5 Points who had an office with good light and direct eyes, and who did not flinch when I talked about the thing the toast did to me, or the thing the toast represented, or why standing at a terrace railing in a green dress had turned out to be the moment everything changed. My grandmother did not reach out to me again after the settlement. I think she understood the silence on my end was not waiting for something. It was finished. What I took from all of this is not something simple. I don't have a clean sentence about family or truth or what the blood test proved. What I have is this. There are people who will organize an entire story around your smallness, because your smallness makes their story larger. They will call that love. They will call it sacrifice. They will raise a glass to it in front of everyone they know and dare you to object. And for a long time you might not object, because you've been taught that gratitude looks like silence and silence looks like peace. But some nights, you find yourself on a terrace at someone else's party, holding a photograph of a woman who has the same jaw as yours, and you realize the story you were given was never the whole story. It was just the version that served someone else. I'm not angry anymore. Not in the way I was. I'm something steadier and a little harder to move. I know my name now. I know where it came from. I know what was taken from me, and I know, with a clarity I did not have 2 years ago, that I am not going to spend the rest of my life repaying a debt that was never real. If someone has made you feel like you owe them for your own existence, I need you to hear me say clearly, you don't. Safety is not a debt. Being cared for is not a debt. You were not brought into this world to be a line item in someone else's budget. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments the one thing you wish someone had told you sooner. And tell me this. What's the version of your story that someone else has been holding on to, and when are you going to take it back? Thank you for being here. Genuinely.